Kidman has made her first public appearance since her split from Keith Urban.
We've been through a lot together.
We've got a timeline for it now, and the time is now.
They had it all: fame, music, family. But when the cameras stopped rolling, something else began. A quiet unraveling, told not through words, but through songs that hurt to sing. It begins quietly, as all endings do. Not with fireworks or headlines, not even with a scandal, just silence. The kind that feels deliberate, heavy, sacred. When the news broke that Nicole Kidman had filed for divorce from Keith Urban after nearly 2 decades of marriage, the world didn't quite know how to respond. There were no dramatic statements, no messy public fights, no social media meltdowns. Just a filing, a few words from representatives, and then nothing. In an industry that feeds on noise, Nicole and Keith chose silence. And that silence said more than any tabloid headline ever could. For years, they had been the exception to Hollywood's rule, the couple who seemed untouchable. 2 artists who had somehow found stillness in the chaos. Nicole with her icy grace and timeless elegance. Keith with his warm southern charm and guitar that never left his side. Together, they were the perfect contrast. Fire and calm, starlight and earth. But behind the smiles, the red carpet poses, and the public declarations of love, there were cracks that only grew deeper with time. The truth was simple and devastating. Even the strongest love can lose its rhythm. It's easy to forget that before she was a global icon, before she was the face of Oscar-winning films and Chanel campaigns, Nicole Kidman was a woman trying to find peace. And before Keith Urban was a country music superstar with sold-out tours and Grammys, he was a man battling himself, his demons, his insecurities, his longing to belong somewhere safe. When they met in 2005, it felt like destiny had finally done something right. Nicole had just survived one of Hollywood's most public heartbreaks, her split from Tom Cruise. The world had seen her smile through the pain, had watched her rebuild herself from the ashes of a marriage that blurred faith, fame, and control. Keith, meanwhile, was a rising star in country music, adored for his honesty and humble beginnings. But fame had its price. Behind the confident stage presence was a man still haunted by addiction, still unsure if he could be loved without the mask of music. And then came Nicole. She once said she knew within minutes that she wanted to marry him, not because of the fame or the charm, but because for the first time she felt seen. Keith saw her not as a movie star, not as an image, but as a person, a woman who still wanted to believe in forever. Their love story unfolded like a modern fairy tale, a whirlwind romance, a wedding in Sydney, 2 children, and for a while, everything seemed perfect. But in Hollywood, perfection is often the first sign that something's being hidden. From the outside, they were luminous. But the truth about Hollywood marriages is that they don't break overnight. They erode quietly, like waves against stone, slow, invisible, inevitable. Nicole spent months on film sets across continents, London, Paris, New York, while Keith toured the world, singing songs of devotion, longing, and pain. The schedules, the distance, the endless spotlight, it all adds up, quietly and painfully. And then there's the performance. Every red carpet, every interview, every award show, they were expected to be the image of love. Smiling, holding hands, whispering inside jokes for the cameras. But off camera, people close to them began to notice something had changed. The warmth between them had cooled. They weren't arguing, but they weren't laughing the same way either. It was as if 2 people who had once moved in perfect rhythm had started dancing to different songs. Still, they tried. They always tried. Nicole stood by Keith through every relapse, every moment of vulnerability. She went with him to rehab, sat beside him through recovery, and reminded the world that love isn't about perfection, it's about presence. And for years, that was enough. Until, one day, it wasn't. By the time the news of their separation reached the press, most people assumed it was a rumor. After all, they had survived so much together. Why would this be any different? But the truth is, sometimes love ends not with betrayal, but with exhaustion. You can give everything you have to another person, your time, your faith, your heart, and still find yourself standing alone at the end, wondering when the rhythm stopped. When Nicole finally filed for divorce, her statement was short, respectful, almost poetic in its restraint. There were no accusations, no bitterness, no blame, just acknowledgement that the chapter had closed. Keith, true to form, said nothing. No interviews, no explanations. Just music, his oldest, truest language. And that's when people started to notice something strange. At his next few concerts, certain songs began disappearing from the setlist. Songs he had once called love letters to Nicole. Songs like The Fighter, the one that had defined their marriage in the public eye, the one about fighting for love no matter how hard it got, it was gone. Fans noticed immediately. The Fighter wasn't just a hit, it was their song, the anthem of their love, and now it was missing. In its place were slower, darker tracks, songs about distance, regret, and acceptance. The change was subtle but unmistakable. It was as if Keith Urban was rewriting his own story, one performance at a time. Meanwhile, Nicole's public appearances took on a new tone. She still smiled for the cameras, still showed up with her trademark grace. But there was something quieter about her, something heavier, yet stronger. In interviews, when asked about love or loss, she would speak with a kind of gentle wisdom. She never named Keith directly, but her words carried weight. Sometimes, she said, love doesn't disappear. It just changes form. It wasn't bitterness. It wasn't sadness. It was acceptance. Hollywood, of course, didn't know what to do with that. There was no scandal to exploit, no villain to frame. Just two people choosing dignity over drama. And in an age when attention is currency, that silence became the loudest statement of all. If you listened closely, though, you could hear it. The grief between the lines, the heartbreak dressed as grace. In a city that runs on reinvention, Nicole Kidman was starting over. And Keith Urban, the man who once sang that she was his reason to fight, was now learning how to sing without her. But endings in Hollywood are never really endings. They're just transitions, one role fading into another, one melody giving way to the next. And as the lights dimmed on the fairy tale, a different kind of story began to take shape. Not about scandal, not about failure, but about silence. Because sometimes silence isn't emptiness. It's preservation. It's the sound of two people choosing peace over pain, privacy over publicity. And maybe, in a town built on noise, that's the bravest act of all. When the cameras moved on from the divorce headlines, the story didn't end. It simply went quiet. And in that quiet, Keith Urban disappeared. Not completely, of course. He still performed, still smiled for fans, still showed up where he was expected to be. But there was a difference now, a subtle distance behind his eyes. A gentleness that felt heavier, as if every note he sang carried the weight of something left unsaid. For nearly 20 years, Keith had lived a life that looked like the perfect song. The devoted husband, the family man, the country star who'd built his home around the woman he called his muse. But after Nicole's departure, the melody broke. The lyrics didn't fit anymore, and for the first time, he stopped trying to make them. What followed wasn't scandal, it was silence. The kind that comes from someone relearning how to breathe after holding it for too long. Keith's story has always been one of survival. Born in New Zealand, raised in Australia, he grew up far from the bright lights of Nashville. His earliest memories weren't of fame or fortune, but of struggle. A father who worked endlessly. A young boy who found comfort in music when words felt too heavy to say aloud. That pattern followed him into adulthood. When success finally came, it came fast. Fame, attention, pressure. The kind that could either make or destroy you. For Keith, it nearly did both. Addiction followed him like a shadow. Alcohol, substances, the temporary escapes that promise warmth but only offer emptiness. He had been to rehab before, long before Nicole entered his life. But love, especially the kind that feels like salvation, can make you believe that the worst parts of yourself have been conquered. When Nicole stood by him during his relapses, the world saw devotion. What they didn't see was the toll it took. The constant worry, the fear of watching someone you love fight battles you can't win for them. And when love becomes survival, it changes both people. After the divorce filing, Keith didn't run to the tabloids. He didn't fight back through the press. Instead, he turned inward, back to the one thing that had always made sense: music. But the music changed. Gone were the anthems of redemption and perseverance. Gone were the love songs with hopeful crescendos. In their place came something rawer, quieter, stripped down. His performances began to feel less like concerts and more like confessions. Fans noticed. Critics noticed. There was a new kind of honesty in his shows. Not the romantic kind that sells records, but the human kind that bleeds a little when you listen too closely. On stage, he would pause between songs longer than he used to. Smile, but only halfway. Speak softly about gratitude, about faith, about the strange grace that comes from falling apart and finding yourself again. And while his audience cheered, you could tell he wasn't performing anymore. He was healing. Behind closed doors, friends said Keith kept to himself more. No lavish parties, no celebrity circles, just his studio, his daughters, his music. He'd talk about learning balance, how to live quietly, how to be present, how to let go without bitterness. He didn't curse the past. He didn't deny it. He just learned to hold it differently. In one rare interview months later, when asked about heartbreak, he didn't mention Nicole's name. But his answer said everything. Sometimes, he said, you spend your whole life writing songs about love. And then one day you realized love was writing songs about you. It wasn't regret. It was revelation. For Keith, the stage had always been his sanctuary, the one place where truth didn't need permission. And that's exactly where the transformation unfolded. He began reworking older songs, the ones that had once sounded like promises. He slowed them down, stripped them of their glossy production, and performed them as if he were finally ready to face the pain inside them. One night in Nashville, fans said he introduced an old ballad, one he'd written during the early years of their marriage, with a quiet smile. He said, "Some songs grow with you, and some songs outgrow you." Then he played it softly, like a goodbye. It wasn't about bitterness or betrayal. It was about change, the slow kind that sneaks up on you when you're not paying attention. The same man who once sang that love could fix everything was now learning that sometimes love's greatest mercy is knowing when to let go. Meanwhile, in the world outside his music, speculation continued. Fans dissected every lyric, every set list, every Instagram caption. They searched for clues, for meaning, for closure. But maybe Keith didn't want closure. Maybe he wanted stillness. He stopped attending Hollywood events. He focused on his daughters, on his small circle of trust, on his quiet routines. He began showing up at local music nights, small venues, dim lights, no fanfare, just a man and a guitar. Those who saw him there said he looked lighter. Tired, yes, but freer. It's a strange thing, fame. It gives you everything you ever wanted, but it takes everything that once made you whole. Keith Urban had lived under its glare for decades. But now, he was learning how to live under something softer. The light that comes after the storm. There's a kind of courage in disappearing. Hollywood trains you to stay visible, to stay relevant, to stay in the conversation. But Keith's silence wasn't a retreat. It was a rebellion. He didn't owe the world an explanation. He didn't owe anyone an ending that made sense. Sometimes stories end quietly because they have to. Because if you try to narrate your own heartbreak while you're still inside it, you end up rewriting the truth to make it easier to live with. So he didn't explain. He just kept singing. And through those songs, you could trace his evolution. From pain to peace, from attachment to acceptance. Each concert felt like a chapter. Each lyric, a confession. Each silence between verses, a prayer. And in that transformation, Keith Urban did something remarkable. He let the music tell the truth he couldn't bring himself to say out loud. To the public, it looked like a man healing in private. But to those who listened closely, it sounded like something even deeper. A man learning to forgive himself. Not for the breakup, not for the pain, but for the years spent trying to be everything to everyone. The husband, the father, the rock star, the redemption story. Keith Urban, the man who once needed the spotlight to survive, had finally found peace without it. And maybe that's the quiet miracle of it all. That the same silence which once felt like loss became the space where healing began. As the months passed, the noise faded. The gossip slowed. The tabloids moved on. But for fans who'd followed him for years, something lingered. A feeling that this version of Keith Urban was truer than ever. Not the polished country idol. Not the man defined by his love story. But the artist who had finally faced his own reflection without fear. He wasn't fighting anymore. He was listening. And in his stillness, the audience found something too. A reminder that healing doesn't always look loud. Sometimes, it's just a quiet man with a guitar, playing the truth in a room full of strangers, each of them holding their own invisible heartbreaks. In that way, Keith Urban didn't just vanish. He transformed. He didn't lose his voice. He refined it. He didn't lose himself. He rediscovered who he was without the noise. And somewhere in that transformation, you could almost hear Nicole's silence answering his. Not as distance, but as understanding. Because sometimes two souls outgrow the same song, but that doesn't mean the music ever really stops. It just changes key. In Hollywood, silence is rare. But in music, silence is sacred. It's the space between the notes that makes the song mean something. And in the months following his divorce, Keith Urban began living in that space, the quiet between what was lost and what was yet to be written. He didn't issue statements. He didn't appear on talk shows to explain himself. Instead, he spoke in the only language he truly trusted: music. For decades, Keith's career had been built on melodies that felt like love letters, to hope, to resilience, to the woman who had once stood beside him in every storm. But now his songs began to shift. The lyrics grew simpler, but heavier. The music softer, but more honest. It was as if he had stopped trying to entertain and started trying to understand. Fans didn't need confirmation of the breakup's impact. They could hear it. The first clues came quietly. New songs scattered through his live sets felt more personal than ever. There were lines about endings, about distance, about love that outlasts the living. One lyric lingered in the minds of fans long after the final chord. "We were thunder, but I forgot how to listen to the rain." It wasn't the kind of line you wrote for radio. It was the kind you wrote when you were alone at 2 a.m., staring at a quiet room, realizing the silence has become a companion. Soon, audiences noticed that Keith's concerts no longer felt like performances. They felt like therapy sessions. Each song was a confession, each pause a kind of mourning. The man who once played for arenas now played as if he were singing to one person who wasn't there. To understand Keith Urban's transformation, you have to understand what the fighter once meant. When the song was first released, it became more than a hit. It was a symbol of their love story. The chorus, where he promised to be her fighter, her protector, her home, became an anthem for couples who believed that love could survive anything. Nicole had even appeared in the music video, smiling, laughing, mouthing the lyrics with him in the car, their chemistry unfiltered and effortless. It was intimate, unguarded, beautiful. But after the divorce, the fighter disappeared from his set lists, without explanation, without a word. To outsiders, it was just a setlist change. But to longtime fans, it felt like a quiet eulogy, because some songs aren't just songs, they're promises. And when those promises break, singing them starts to hurt more than staying silent. Keith's artistry has always walked the line between hope and heartbreak. He doesn't write to escape pain, he writes to survive it. In the months following the separation, you could see that process unfolding in real time. His voice, once smooth and optimistic, began carrying a new kind of tremor, the kind that comes from truth. Music critics began calling his new work stripped, vulnerable, unfiltered. But those words don't quite capture what was really happening. He wasn't reinventing himself. He was returning to himself. There's something profoundly human about the way pain reshapes an artist. It removes the polish, the production, the narrative control. It leaves behind the raw core, just a man with his memories and a guitar, trying to make sense of both. But Keith's confession wasn't only in the lyrics, it was in the silences between them. At his shows, he began introducing songs with small fragments of thought, reflections that felt almost accidental. He'd say things like, "Sometimes the hardest thing about love isn't losing it, it's carrying it," or "You can forgive somebody long before you stop missing them." And every time, the audience went still. Because those words didn't sound like performance. They sounded like healing. When he played older hits, they sounded different too. The joy was still there, but so was something else. The awareness that those songs belonged to a version of himself that no longer existed. One night, after performing Blue Ain't Your Color, he paused for a moment and smiled. "You know," he said, "sometimes blue fits better than you think." The crowd laughed gently. But behind that humor was something honest. A man who had learned to live with sadness without letting it destroy him. Nicole Kidman, for her part, never commented publicly on his music. She didn't need to. But when reporters asked her about art and emotion, she gave an answer that seemed to echo his transformation. She said, "Art is how we survive the things we can't say out loud." That's the mercy of it. It was a rare glimpse into her understanding. That what they shared, even in its ending, was never wasted. That music, in its own way, was still a bridge between them. They might have been living separate lives, but they were still writing in the same language. The language of letting go. In interviews during this period, Keith spoke carefully. When asked about his creative process, he said he'd stopped chasing hits, that he wanted to make music that felt true, even if it hurt. He began working late into the night, recording in small studios, collaborating with songwriters who valued honesty over polish. Some of those sessions never made it onto an album. They were never meant to. They were just moments, musical snapshots of someone trying to heal, And yet, even in his pain, there was hope. His songs didn't sound bitter. They sounded grateful. Grateful for the love that once was, for the lessons it left behind, for the peace that followed the storm. One new track opened with the line, "I thought the fight was the proof of love." Turns out the silence was. It was simple, but it said everything. Music has a strange kind of memory. You can rewrite it, remix it, re-sing it, but it always remembers who you were when you wrote it. For Keith, that meant every time he stepped on stage, he was confronting his past. Not to relive it, but to reclaim it. There's power in that. In turning heartbreak into harmony, in transforming loss into melody. It's how art redeems pain. And in doing that, Keith Urban reminded the world that confession doesn't always come through words or interviews. Sometimes, it comes through the quiet strum of a guitar in front of thousands of people, each carrying their own invisible ache. As the world speculated, he never faltered in his kindness. When fans asked about Nicole, he never spoke ill of her, never used their history for sympathy. Instead, he spoke about love with reverence, as something that shaped him, even in its ending. He once said on stage, "You don't stop loving someone just because the story changes. You just love them differently." And that single line silenced the crowd, because in a world addicted to blame, Keith chose grace. He wasn't hiding his heartbreak. He was honoring it. And that's what makes his silence so profound. In Hollywood, people are trained to move on quickly. New headlines, new faces, new distractions. But Keith didn't rush. He let the silence breathe. He let the pain turn into art. He didn't erase his past. He respected it. Each lyric, each melody, each pause became part of a quiet conversation between the man he used to be and the one he was becoming. He wasn't performing for applause anymore. He was performing for understanding. For himself, for the people who listened, for the idea that maybe heartbreak can be holy if you let it teach you something. Because at the heart of it all, music is confession. Not the kind you whisper in a church or cry into a pillow, but the kind that saves you. Note by note, word by word. Keith Urban didn't just confess his pain. He transformed it. And in that transformation, he gave everyone listening permission to do the same. In every broken lyric, in every trembling chorus, there was a lesson. That love doesn't have to last forever to be real. That endings don't erase the beauty of what came before. And that sometimes silence, that unbearable golden silence, is the truest sound of all. Every great love story leaves behind an echo. For Nicole Kidman and Keith Urban, that echo wasn't made of scandal or bitterness. It was made of lessons, melodies, and quiet grace. To understand the man behind those songs, you have to go back long before the lights, before the awards, before Hollywood ever learned his name. Keith Urban was born in Whangarei, New Zealand, a small town that felt a world away from the arenas he would one day fill. His childhood wasn't glamorous. It was filled with uncertainty, with the long hours of a father working hard to make ends meet, and the constant hum of country music playing from a worn-out radio. He wasn't born into fame, he built it from the ground up. By the time he was 6, music wasn't just a dream. It was an escape, a refuge, a language that understood him even when the world didn't. His mother used to say that when Keith played guitar, the world disappeared, and maybe that's why he never put it down. Because for Keith, music wasn't just a career, it was a way of surviving. But survival comes with scars. As he rose to fame, the bright lights of Nashville and Hollywood brought temptation, the kind that looks like success on the outside, but empties you out on the inside. By his late 20s, Keith was living two lives, the artist adored by millions, and the man battling the quiet chaos of addiction behind closed doors. That's when Nicole entered his story. They met in 2005 at an event neither had planned to attend. Nicole had just come out of one of the most public divorces in Hollywood history. Keith was still fighting to find his footing in a world that rewarded image more than honesty. Their connection was immediate, not loud or dramatic, but quiet. The kind of connection that feels like coming home after being lost for years. Nicole once described their first meeting as unexpected peace. Keith called it light breaking through the clouds. Their marriage wasn't a fairy tale, it was redemption. When they married in 2006, it wasn't the glitz of the ceremony that mattered. It was what came after. Just 4 months into their marriage, Keith entered rehab. For many couples, that would have been the breaking point. For them, it became the beginning of something deeper. Nicole didn't walk away, she stayed. Through the fear, the confusion, the long nights of silence when she wasn't sure if love would be enough to save him, Keith later said, "She saved my life." Those words weren't romantic exaggeration, they were truth. Because without her, he might not have found the strength to rebuild. The years that followed were their golden chapter. Two people who had known loss finding beauty in the ordinary. They built a family away from the noise. Sunday barbecues, bedtime stories, school pickups, moments that made them feel human again. For Nicole, who had spent years under the glare of public scrutiny, this was sanctuary. For Keith, it was salvation. Together, they became proof that love could heal even the most fractured hearts. But love that deep also demands truth. And truth can be brutal. Fame has a way of testing what's real. Between global tours, film shoots, and the constant hum of attention, distance began to form. Not out of anger, but exhaustion. They weren't breaking apart. They were quietly drifting. And when that drift became impossible to ignore, they did what few Hollywood couples ever do. They chose honesty. There were no public fights, no cruel words, just two people who realized that sometimes love changes form. Nicole once said in an interview, "Some relationships end, but that doesn't mean they fail. Some stories just finish their chapter." And that's what theirs was. A finished chapter. Not erased, not regretted, just complete. When the divorce became public, the media tried to write its own version of their ending. Some called it shocking, others called it predictable. But the truth was quieter, more human. They hadn't stopped caring. They had simply stopped pretending that love alone could solve everything. And maybe that's the hardest kind of courage, the courage to walk away without bitterness. Keith didn't blame Nicole in interviews. Nicole didn't dissect the marriage for headlines. They both chose silence, not out of pride, but respect. Because sometimes silence says more than any statement ever could. Today, Keith Urban still performs, still writes, still smiles that same disarming smile that first drew people in. But if you listen closely, his songs tell the story of a man who has walked through the fire and learned how to live with its warmth instead of its burn. His music now isn't about chasing perfection. It's about accepting imperfection. It's about forgiveness, about peace, about what remains after the applause fades. And Nicole, she continues to evolve too. Still luminous on screen, still graceful in her quiet strength, still fiercely protective of the parts of her life that fame can't touch. She once said, "Peace is my rebellion." And in a world that thrives on chaos, that might be the most powerful thing she's ever done. When you strip away the headlines, the rumors, the speculation, what remains is a story of two people who found each other at the right time, helped each other heal, and then let each other go. That's not tragedy, that's growth. It's rare in Hollywood to see a breakup handled with such dignity, no public blame, no revenge narratives, no bitterness disguised as art. Just a quiet goodbye. Maybe that's why their story resonates so deeply. Because it reminds us that not all endings are failures. Some are simply transitions, from one kind of love to another, from shared life to separate peace. In the end, Nicole Kidman and Keith Urban didn't just survive Hollywood, they transcended it. Their love began as a song, full of hope, melody, and light. It ended as silence, reflective, tender, bittersweet. And maybe that's the real beauty of their story, because in silence there is understanding, and in understanding there is grace. Theirs was never about scandal, it was about humanity, about how even the brightest stars can burn out quietly, leaving behind warmth instead of ashes. And that's what makes it unforgettable. Because long after the cameras fade and the tabloids move on, what remains are the echoes, the laughter, the lessons, the music that carries both their fingerprints. The sound of love, the sound of loss, and finally, the sound of peace. At Cinematic Sins, where Hollywood stories are told, not just reported. Because sometimes, the truth isn't in the headlines, it's in the silence between them.